Thank you so much. We are the warm up before infected mushrooms. There's still a long day to go, and we have a fascinating panel. Hello from New York. My name is Tal Heinrich, and I'm a journalist and news anchor, nowadays a contributor for Quick Hits. Rebooting an economy in free fall. That's the topic for today's conversation as governments around the world are still struggling to balance between their exit strategies, efforts to recover the economy, reopening the economy, and of course, also controlling a pandemic. So, to discuss the policies, trade offs, and levers that governments around the world can use in their efforts to try to stabilize the economies going forward, I would like to introduce a very distinguished panel, but unfortunately, begin also with a quick apology. Professor Manuel Trachtenberg is not able to attend the session today. In attendance, though, with us are Abby Joseph Cohen, Advisory Director and Senior Investment Strategist at Goldman Sachs. She's based in New York. Simon Paris joining us from London today, Chief Executive Officer at Finastra. Ashok Chandrasekhar, Head of the International Corporate and Securities Department at Goldfarb Seligman, joining us from Tel Aviv, and Rafaela Sadon, based in Boston. She's Professor of Business Administration in the Strategy Unit at Harvard Business School. So good to see you again, guys. I have to tell you, we're living in very strange times that I actually feel excited and even relieved to be discussing a terrible economic crisis and not what's happening right outside my window here in New York City, although we will touch on this unrest as well. So to begin, I would like to have a quick roundup of your thoughts and predictions around the same question addressed to all of our panelists. How do you see the economy going forward, either in the US and Israel, or in terms of global trends after the first wave of the pandemic? Abby, let's begin with you. Oh, Abby, I think we cannot. Okay, I think you're muted, so I think you have to fix it. Okay, now we have it. I no, we can't hear you still. So let's give you some time to fix the problem and continue with.
One moment.
Here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. So, Abby, how do you see the economy going forward? Let's go.
Okay, so I was about to say my apologies for the technical problems today. With regard to the U.S. economy, clearly we have very significant issues. We are expecting that overall GDP this year in the United States will be down 6 or 7% relative to a year ago. It's a very big decline. The reported unemployment rate may go as high as 20 to 25%. But when we take a look at the United States versus some other countries, interestingly, we are a little bit less afflicted on the economic side, but we're more afflicted on the medical side. It's very clear that in the United States, we did not move as quickly as we needed to in terms of the lockdown. While many people were looking for the virus to come in from Asia, it in fact came to us from Europe. And one of the reasons that New York was so hard hit is that about 3 million visitors, including Americans returning from Europe, came through our major airports over those last few weeks between the time of the China shutdown and the time that we finally closed travel from Europe. The U.S. Economy has suffered, but the health has suffered more. We now have had more than 105,000 deaths in the United States, a third of those in New York, in the New York metro area. Now, an important question is what happens going forward, and much depends upon the economy reopening. And let me share with you the following news. People look at the average numbers for the United States, saying the curve has been bent, things are looking much better. This is not the case outside New York. Most of the improvement has been because New York has really gone through a very significant lockdown. We now have less than 1/10 the number of new daily cases that we had previously, but there are significant outbreaks in other places. So, for example, in 16 other states, the cases are rising, and in some situations, very considerably. And we have a very significant increase in places that, unlike New York, don't have very good healthcare systems. So when these people become ill, the outcome for them is not likely to be as good as it was in New York. Not that it was a happy situation in New York. We've had many deaths, but we do at least have very significant tertiary care, acute care facilities in New York. Not the case in some smaller cities, and certainly not the case in some rural areas. Now, I'm happy to speak about the economy, obviously, but I'd like to put the health crisis number one. The economic crisis number two in the United States, we think it's going to be basically in two very big phases. We could see a notable snapback in the United States in the second half of this year and into 2021, but that's only going to get us about halfway back. The unemployment rate may go down substantially to about 10%, but it's still 10%, pretty high. And we think that one of the things that this double crisis has done has been to uncover some of the major structural problems that we're facing. Inequality, not just in terms of healthcare, but inequality in terms of the economy. And one of the concerns that many of us have is that some of the jobs that have been lost during the pandemic will not be coming back because of structural issues, a move towards technological replacement, but also keep in mind the following, and this will be my last point at this stage of our discussion. We have had a system put in place at our federal level. Most of those benefits begin to fade out in July. And it's at that point that we may, in fact, see another wave of bankruptcies, and we may see just how bad the structural unemployment picture is. So I think that from an economic standpoint, maybe we have seen the bottom. I certainly hope that we did in the April-May timeframe, but the recovery is going to be slow and halting. And I think a lot of small businesses in particular are going to feel the pain, and so too will their employees. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Abby. We will discuss, we will touch all of these important points. I want this first round to be quite brief, but Simon, how are things looking from London?
Yeah, so I'm not a qualified economist, so I'll talk through the lens of a business perspective. We're a technology software provider around the world. Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about the shape of a possible recovery. Do we see a U, a W, an L, or what some people refer to as a swoosh? And what we're really seeing, if I look back on the last 90 days, is we are seeing a bit of a bounce back already in China, Greater China, in terms of them making significant steps back to normal economic activity and normal investment profiles. We saw that also in Australasia. In Europe, and then specifically in London, to answer your question, it's a little bit more of a malaise. You know, the latest projections that we're receiving from the different economists and consultancies is that it may take a number of years before we get back to 2019 GDP levels. So that's obviously alarming in terms of thinking about the malaise that can cause. Building on what the previous speaker was saying, in America, we do anticipate much more of a bounce, a V shape, but maybe only halfway there by the end of the calendar year.
Ashok Chandrasekhar, I've been practicing this one. Ashok, how are things looking from Tel Aviv? What is your prediction?
So, lawyers are well known as being incredibly risk-averse people. So I sort of surprise myself when I say this, but I'm actually rather optimistic about how things are going, at least in Israel. I admit that I perceive the world through the somewhat narrow perspective of cross-border transactions, mostly in the technology sphere. But even looking around us, Abby referred to the health situation as being something that we really need to pay very close attention to. And I would like to say that it seems that Israel has done a really good job of managing the health situation about as well as you could possibly do. Now, a lot of us are concerned that tight management is being relaxed a little bit too quickly, and we're rushing now to get back to normal and open up the economy again. But looking at the details of what's been going on for the past few months, I think that if you look at two major segments of the Israeli economy that are important both here in Israel and to Americans who pay a lot of attention to Israel, and that would be the tech ecosystem and hospitality and tourism. Hospitality and tourism is a catastrophe right now. Something like 40% of the restaurants in Israel are in the process of, or at risk of going out of business if they don't quickly jump back into action. And all of the hotels have been closed for months, and there are untold thousands of people unemployed as a result of this. But in the tech ecosystem, things are going better. And we can talk later about why, but there's a lot of deal making, a lot of investment flowing into Israel. So things are looking up.
Thank you for bringing this positive point of view. Rafaela, how do you see things going forward from where you are?
So I'm in a very unusual position because I'm based in Boston, but I'm actually looking very carefully at my country of origin, which is Italy, as you can hear from my accent. I would say two things. One, I'm in complete agreement with the prior speakers. What happens is largely a function of what's going to happen on the health side. As soon as we will be able to guarantee some sort of conditions in which we can test, trace, and isolate cases, it's going to be very hard for consumption and for investments to restart. Having said that, the second point that is emerging from the data is that this is a crisis that is very unequal. And so it's going to be very hard to predict one average effect. In fact, what we see is that although on average, there will be 42% of current job losses that are going to be unfortunately permanent in the US, this is a shock that is very asymmetric. In some industries, actually, as a shock was just saying, there are great opportunities. And unfortunately, other industries, especially those that are facing the customer, this will be a moment of profound reflection. And I'm also believe that some business models will have to change. Some business models, unfortunately, and some businesses, unfortunately, will have to close. So I think we have to be ready for uncertainty and for a very uneven phase going forward.
Mm-hmm. A lot of uncertainty. Abby Joseph Cohen, this next question is to you. I want us to take a deeper dive here. So President Trump said just a few weeks ago that he won't allow the cure to be worse than the disease. And most of the states have already started reopening their economies. As we know, here in the country, the US Congress passed the $2.2 trillion relief package. And as we know, there is another $3 trillion relief package on the line. Can you maybe share with us your view about these efforts? What should we keep in mind if we really want to get out of this economic crisis as quickly as possible? This question is for Abby.
Me?
Can Abby hear me? Oh, there she goes. Oh, maybe
you. One moment.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
So yeah, we can. So what should we keep in mind if we really want to get out of this economic crisis as quickly as possible?
Yeah, one of the things we need to keep in mind is that there's the short term and the long term. The United States moved surprisingly quickly in terms of not just fiscal stimulus, which was roughly 9 or 10% of GDP, which is really quite a large amount, more than twice what was done in the 2008 crisis. But very importantly, the Federal Reserve kind of stepped up. And the Federal Reserve said, don't worry, whatever needs to get done, we'll do. We'll provide the liquidity. And they used a number of the vehicles that were developed in 2008, 2010, but they also added a few things. So for the first time ever, they said they would step in potentially and buy corporate bonds. So this has served as an important backstop to financial markets. So for those people who are wondering why, with such a dire economic picture currently and a dire health picture currently, why the stock market in the United States is doing so well, a lot of it has to do with this promise from the Federal Reserve in terms of liquidity, and investors are basically looking over the valley or potentially several valleys in economic activity. And what's priced in right now, interestingly, to the S&P 500 is year-end 2021, looking into 2022. And one of the concerns that I would have is, okay, if you think that things will go smoothly between now and then, current prices are justified. But if you think there can be some hiccups or some things even more dramatic, it could be far worse than that. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of the US stock market is that it's heavily dominated by two sectors. The two sectors that are doing okay in this environment. One is technology, which is 25% of the S&P 500, and the other big sector is healthcare. But if we take a look at some of the other sectors of our economy and our stock market, they're much smaller than these two, and they're not performing nearly as well.
Abby, I just want to follow up on some things that you said in regards to the stimulus. You know, people tend to believe that governments have money, and only if the government could, divide or distribute this money in a very wise way, then all of our economic problems will be solved. So in that sense, I know you're talking about the short term and the long term. On one hand, when we try to jumpstart the economy by providing these kind of relief packages, we're probably borrowing at the expense of next generations, of our grandchildren. But on the other hand, this is probably a very good time to do so because, as you said, there's a lot of liquidity. And governments in the UK, for example, are getting paid to borrow money where they issued bonds at a negative rate. So where do you fall between these two narratives? Are we building a higher cliff now that will just make our next economic downfall more painful? Could it be?
It's a wonderful question for which I don't have an answer with which I feel 100% comfortable. I'm a trained economist. I worked at the Federal Reserve. It sort of goes against my grain to say, don't worry about budget deficits. On the other hand, if we don't spend the money now, the economic abyss could be enormously dramatic. And one of the things we have going for us now is that inflation is quite low. Interest rates are quite low. And at least for now, the rest of the world is very happy to own dollar-denominated securities, including bonds. So the cost of this finance at present is actually quite low. One of the things that might be helpful is if the U.S. Treasury decided to further increase what we refer to as the duration of their borrowings, that is the time maturity. Israel, I believe, issued a 100-year bond not that long ago. In the United States, typically our Treasury funds itself 1 year or 2 years or less. But we are beginning to see increased demand for longer term bonds, including 20-year bonds. So it's a multiple way to answer your question. Number one, I think we really do need to spend the money now to avoid this economic black hole, number one. Number two, the hope is that our economy will grow and that will help us pay off this debt. And number three, there is a time for fiscal austerity, but it's not now.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a mistake to apply those kinds of rules. It's one of the reasons I'm concerned about the budgets at the state and local level. Unlike the federal government in the United States, which can borrow, state and local governments typically have to stay within balance on their budgets on a 1 year time horizon. There's a little flexibility for some entities, they have a 2 year horizon, but basically assume that state and local governments have to balance their budgets. And there's going to be a real problem. A lot of the discussion in terms of what the next big package might be from Congress would be relief, not just for the healthcare system, which is now running in large deficits, but also the state and local governments. You know, think about the state and city of New York, which has spent many billions of dollars unexpectedly dealing with the health crisis. If in fact those budgets have to be balanced, money will have to come from someplace, probably from the educational system, other important essential services. That's exactly where you don't want to take the money from. Something we'll talk about later, of course, is where do you get long-term growth? Long-term growth comes from investment. It comes from investment in people through the educational system. It comes from investment in science and education, and also in terms of innovation. And if we basically cut those funds now, we're, to use an American expression, we're eating our seed corn. We're basically stealing from the future in order to pay current situation.
Well, either way, we might be doing it. Simon Paris, we keep hearing the phrase the new normal. And every time I pose this question to people, I get different answers. Some people don't even believe that there is going to be a new normal. Where do you stand?
Yeah, great question. So you hear the phrases return to new normal, a new normal, or the one that I subscribe to is what is normal? So we're a company of 10,000 people, and I can look across that group and look for patterns. And obviously, I can look out in my network and see what people are thinking and doing. And for me, it really boils down to two things. Firstly, people are going through a recalibration of what really matters. The number of people who said to me, you know what, I'm not sure I want to travel like I used to. Or, you know what, I've rediscovered that I have a role to play with my elderly parents. Or I've rediscovered that I want to have more time with my children. Or I want some more work life balance now that I've proven that it can be done more from home. So I think one part of the answer is this recalibration of what really matters. The second answer is the full rainbow, the full spectrum of what people are looking for from what normal may look like when we get there. So at one end of the spectrum, we've got people who are desperate to get back, almost from mental health issues, to a normal work environment, because it's part of their social network, it's part of their social interactions. Others may have even more significant reasons for wanting to get back, maybe escaping physical abuse or for their own mental health. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are terrified about returning to a new normal and want full reassurance that there'll be social distancing and good work practices, including intermittent working. So I think for business leaders, how you think about what people are recalibrating and what they're looking for will define a new normal. But I don't think it's a normal that we recognize in the rearview mirror.
Very good points. Well, even if restrictions are lifted on the economy, people might change their act following this experience. Before we continue, I'm reminded here in the chat that our audience, our participants, you are very welcome to send your questions. We will later in the session address these questions to our panelists. Ashok Chandrasekhar, I love saying your last name. After I practice it, I feel like I have to repeat it again and again. You know, as someone who represents tech companies, and I know you're involved in many international transactions, do you believe that this crisis is going to push us backwards in terms of international cooperation and trade and business between governments? What signs can you share with us from the front lines of deal making these days?
So one of the things that I love about a conversation like this, where you've got theorists and practical people, and you've got people from finance and from business and from academics and from law, is you discover that we actually look at these questions oftentimes from different angles, but arrive at roughly the same type of answers from our different perspectives. And what I'd like to share is that the concept of looking over the valley to the end of 2021 is something that makes a lot of sense in the context of venture capital investing and technology investing in Israel and the United States, I believe. There's a lot in common between the two. You know, the way that deals get done here are not necessarily reflecting immediate economic concerns of today. They're reflecting the investors and the entrepreneurs' understanding of what's going to be happening 6, 12, 24 months from now. And so what we're actually seeing today is that on the business-to-business level, deals are going on and people are talking. And we even have major deals being closed. I'll talk about, for instance, that Intel just acquired Innovate in Israel for about $1 billion. And the individuals who were involved in that deal were quoted in the press as saying that the deal was conducted entirely via Zoom. So it is possible to do big deals even in the face of very, very difficult obstacles to the type of personal interaction that deal making requires. Having said that, there are also governmental issues involved. So for instance, in getting deals done in Israel, we often need to get various tax rulings, and the income tax authority has slowed down its reaction time, and so that could slow down the process of getting deals done. Same with antitrust. We have an interesting problem where different antitrust authorities in different countries are reacting differently to the situation. So for instance, in Israel, the antitrust authority has said that it will take into consideration the COVID crisis in assessing certain types of restrictive arrangements that might otherwise be problematic. But in the UK, the antitrust authority has, as I understand it, said the exact opposite, that they're not going to make any relaxation of standards. So it's an interesting time to be making deals, but I think that overall, at least in the tech industry, people are very interested in looking forward. And as Simon said, what we see forward may be different from what we see in the rearview mirror, but it's still there is a path forwards.
Thank you, Ashok. Raphael, this next question is for you. Your research focuses on the economics of productivity, management, and organizational change. Now, President Trump a few weeks ago said that all those jobs lost will be back. Do you think the president is correct, or is it rather a campaign trail? Not that we have a campaign trail right now, but a wishful thinking.
So the answer is, my sense is that this is a very hard thing to promise at this point. It's pretty much to some extent, it's in the policymakers' hands what's going to happen to employment. And this goes back to the point that I made earlier. We know it's a shock that is impacting very negatively certain parts of the industry, of the economy, and in particular, the weakest part of the economy, low-skilled workers, women often, and people that have jobs that are not easy to transfer online. So the answer to that question, I think, in part depends on what do you do with all the human resources, the human capital that is currently working in industries that are not able to sustain the pandemic. My sense is that here policymakers have a big responsibility. I'm by no means, an ideological person, but I see great value in policies that at this point are active labor market policies that, for example, invest in the education and in the retraining, not only of younger people, but also of middle-aged and older workers. This is a time where the opportunity cost of training is zero for many people. And I think that there is really value, as Abby was saying before, when she was speaking, I wanted to hug her from Boston. That's exactly right. This is a time where you think about investing for the future, investing in education. I want to stretch this argument, saying that also managers and business people, perhaps going back to what Simon was saying and Ashok was saying, this is a time of reinvention. And I would encourage also business people to engage in this reflection. We are talking with many businesses around the world right now, in part to understand what this crisis means for them. And what we are seeing is a lot of resilience, a lot of innovation, a lot of experimentation. But that implies sometimes following a very different value proposition, very different business model, not only with the technology of having meetings or Zooms online, but also, for example, how do you care for your employees when you don't see them every day? How do you sustain your culture? How do you think about reaching your customer? I think Israel is in a great position because there is a lot of innovation in that respects too. But this should be, I think, the mantra for the business people in every sector, in every country. How do we adapt? Business is not going to be as usual, and there is going to be a lot of reinvention.
Abby, I want to circle back to you. And, this e-summit is titled Tomorrow, but if we want to discuss what the future, we should also be looking into the past. Senator Chuck Schumer said a few weeks ago, and I'm quoting, "We need bold action. We need Franklin Rooseveltian type action, and we hope to take that in the House and the Senate in a very big and bold way." Chuck Schumer is not the only person right now around the world looking back to the Great Depression, but what I do find is that Democrats and Republicans in this country have very different conclusions from this time of history. From what I know, unemployment when FDR took over was almost as high as it was 6 years later. And the US economy only healed from the Great Depression 2 decades later, mainly thanks to Truman policies of creating business-friendly environments, and not so much thanks to the job programs. But I know that many Democrats have a different narrative around the New Deal. So I wanted to ask you, where do you stand? Because if we can't learn from past mistakes, then we might repeat them.
The environment today is different. than it was in the Great Depression. One of the key things that happened in the Great Depression was, in fact, a financial crisis, which in large part precipitated it. And when banks don't work, it's very difficult for any institution, small families and so on, to get the capital they need. The failure of the banks, in which many families lost their savings, was also a national tragedy. But let's kind of roll forward in terms of where we are now and what some of the policy options are. I find it rather amusing in a way that when there is a Democrat in the White House, the Republicans oppose large budget deficits. But when there's a Republican in the White House, it's not a problem. And we have never had budget deficits as large as we have today, either in terms of dollars or as a percentage of GDP. I mean, these are extremely large budget deficits. And so one of the questions I have for the future is as follows. If we have a Democrat in the White House following the next election, what will the Republicans in the Congress do? Will they put the brakes on, as they did on Mr. Obama in 2009, 2010, in which the fiscal impulse, that is, what was the GDP impact of that fiscal policy, was actually quite negative. GDP growth in those years would have been a full percentage and a half, 1.5% higher than it was. So instead of the recorded 2%, it would have been 3.5%. So what we don't know about the future is what the Congress in particular will do, specifically the Republicans, number one. Number two, prior to the inauguration of Donald Trump, there was bipartisan support for spending on the future, at least in the form of infrastructure. I think that many people know that U.S. infrastructure is in significant need of update and upgrade. It's not just the airports, it's also our electrical systems, the water systems, and so on, need to be brought into the 21st century. This would be a great opportunity to do that now. Cost of capital is extremely low, and we have significant slack in the labor force. That's an economist's way of saying there are lots of people who'd like to work. And I think that this would be a great opportunity. So, while we harken back perhaps to FDR and those projects and those programs, the programs for the 21st century would look somewhat different. And I think, to reiterate a point made previously, much of the investment we need to do is in human capital. It's not just in the technology itself. It's not just in the hard goods themselves, the roads and the transportation systems. It's also in our people. One of the things where we have fallen down dramatically as a nation has been our commitment to long-term investment in brain power. Let me give you an example. In the 1960s, we invested a dramatic amount of US GDP and about 12 or 13% of our annual federal budget into scientific research. That number is now well under 1%. And so we are simply not investing as a nation in the manner in which we did. If we take all of the basic research investment that gets done, the R&D, including by corporations in the United States, prior to the pandemic, it was running about 2.5% of GDP. Take it back a few decades rather, it was 5 or 6% of GDP. We were number one in the world in terms of that intensity of investment. The United States is now in the middle of the pack. We haven't kept up with ourselves, and we're certainly not keeping up with what other nations are doing. And I think that's where the body politic really needs to be focusing on, making sure that we're making these long-term investments. I understand that we need to take care of things right away, but we also need to think about the long term. One more point, if I may, on workers. Obviously, the inequality that we see now in the United States has been a long-term problem. It has been worsening dramatically under the pandemic. One of the things that could be considered right away would be to lift the federal minimum wage. We've not done that in many, many years. The federal minimum wage currently is at a ridiculously low level, dramatically below the poverty level in the United States. And the movement that we've seen in a number of states to raise that minimum wage to $15 an hour, if that was something that served as direction for the whole nation, I think that would be very helpful as well.
Mhm. Well, some would say that increasing the minimum wage will hurt the ones who are most in need eventually.
There is a school of thought that says when you raise the minimum wage, you actually hurt job creation. The data in most places does not agree with that. The data in most places goes along with what Henry Ford said about his Model T. He wanted to pay his workers much more than those workers were being paid in other factories, because he wanted his workers to be able to afford to buy a Model T. And one of the things that we did see in terms of the first reaction, that first package to the pandemic that the Congress passed, is that something like 2/3 of all Americans who are receiving those benefits are actually had a higher income in April than they had before the pandemic. And the idea was, let's have money in people's pockets so they can spend the money, which will help keep the economy going.
Mhm. Simon Paris, let's talk about where all this money is going to. Let's shift to the market. Reportedly, people right now are hoarding cash. Well, the ones who are still employed are saving money. So where is all this money really going to, given that the interest rate is so low? What are your short-term, long-term predictions?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I'd love to hear Rafaela's point of view on this. So, from a corporate perspective, back in January, I think there was somewhere in the region of close to $20 trillion being held at negative interest rates. So, in that paradox between people looking for yield and looking for security, I would imagine the number that's being held at negative interest rates is even higher now. However, yield must be sought. So I think people are going to start discriminating between the types of businesses that may bounce back more quickly or that may benefit from what we call internally COVID bringing the future forward. But it is very interesting when you move out of the corporate realm into the household realm. I see it here in my own country. The news this morning is that savings rates are dramatically higher. Now, how will people behave as we come through COVID? Will they start increasing their spending? Will they return to normal spending? Or will they continue to cash hoard? If they continue to cash hoard, then will you need to create stimulus, maybe through negative interest rates, to get people spending again, or more appropriately, investing again? So it's an interesting question, but I think the old joke is forecasting is very hard to do, especially when it's about the future. But would love to hear what Rafaela thinks of that.
I don't have
Rafaela,
a crystal ball, Simon, but I would say, the intuition that there will be a significant flood of resources going to companies that are willing to innovate. I think it's exactly right. In the sense that we already see, and the examples that I was mentioning just earlier are come from all over the world. We actually see companies that are now scouting for opportunities. So I think it's really interesting how this is a moment of extreme crisis for some parts of the economy, but for others, it's clear that there is unmet demand. It's clear that there are ways in which you can reach the customer that are unprecedented. And I also want to say it's clear that you can win some organizational inertia. For example, the fact that we can run this conference like that many people, even with all their workforce, are now able to use technology. This opens enormous opportunities. So I'm going to do the economist trick. I'm not going to tell you where to put your money, but I think that there will be a place where you can put for your money for sure at some point. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Let's jump to Israel now. I know a lot of our audience and participants are based in Israel. They're interested to see how this relationship between Israel and the rest of the world is going to play out, both politically and economically, following this crisis. And on the business side of things, Ashok, how do you see these developments going forward? Do you see developments triggered by the pandemic and the economic responses to the crisis leading to some change in terms of foreign investment in Israel, mergers and acquisitions?
I think that the investment in Israel is nowadays especially based on certain business fundamentals. There was a time really, let's say, more than 30 years ago, when investment in Israel was a more emotional or aspirational act by many people throughout the world. Today, people invest in Israel because it's really good business. As Rafaela said, companies that innovate are rewarded, and there has been tremendous innovation in Israel over the past 30 years, let's call it, to the point where, you know, Abby was referring to the percent of GDP that's spent on you know, research. Here in Israel, I'm not a numbers person, but I'm sure it's significantly higher than the number that was cited for the United States. And a lot of that money is actually private investment coming from venture capital funds and from large corporations. And I don't see that drying up. I don't even frankly see it slowing down. Now, there is, of course, going to be a blip right now. We can't avoid the fact that the practicalities of getting deals done, the practicalities of meeting and talking about each other's business will slow down the possibility to get deals done. But long-term, looking forwards, the large companies that are looking for innovative opportunities are going to keep on buying Israeli companies, and the investors who are looking for places, and again, I'm like Rafaela, I'm not going to give investment advice because I'm just a lawyer, but lots of people are putting money into Israeli-oriented venture capital funds today. Even in the past 2 months, there have been closings of 2 major venture capital funds, one focused on cybersecurity and one a more generalist fund that invest purely in Israel. So is it going to be a problem? Maybe a little bit of a slowdown, but overall, I think we're looking upwards.
Well, some of our audience, people keep sending me some questions, and I see that a lot of them are focusing on 2 things. One is Europe, the other is China. So first, I would like to address this question to Rafaela. You're based in Boston, but as you said, you have a lot of experience working and consulting to European buddies. 2020 has been a very difficult year for the European Union, first with Brexit, but also the pandemic that has exposed some wounds or weaknesses of the Union. How do you see the bloc coming out of this crisis?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it's a crucial question for the future of Europe. It didn't start well. I have to say that as an Italian, we were the first ones to be hit by the crisis. And initially, you know, we were treated like exotic animals in the sense that I don't think that the UK or France or Spain really understood what was coming their way. If you remember, already in February, March, they were still having football matches in the UK. Which were after led to super spreading events. So I think that initially Europe met this crisis with tremendous myopia, I have to say, and lack of solidarity. However, what is really amazing, it's what's happening over the past few weeks, and in particular with the Recovery Fund and Merkel and Macron coming together with tremendous amount of resources going specifically to the weakest countries, including Italy. This to me is a sign of change. And I'm very hopeful that we will be able to make the best of this, first of all, of this gesture, and second, of the funds. I think it's important that this is also a moment in which we don't lose sight of the threat of populism and the fact that this gesture may be derailed by nationalistic pressures. So I think it's it's clear that people have understood the importance of unity, and it's now up to the individual countries to seize this opportunity.
I want to shift to China. Abby, this question is for you. These last few months, of course, have shifted a lot of the global attention to China. It started way before the pandemic with the tariff war with the US, but then came the virus that originated from China, and of course, the latest power grip over Hong Kong that is really changing things. What are you reading into global cooperation with China going forward? Is China going to suffer financially, do you think, or is it mainly going to be an image blow for the country?
I think the construct that we need to use is that in the 21st century, the global conflict will be between the 2 major powers, being the United States and China. And let's view it in that context. I personally believe that some of the policy decisions made by the current administration in the United States actually has been helpful to China. So, for example, most recently, the withdrawal of the United States from the World Health Organization was done because of comments that WHO had not done its job properly and that China was trying to have too much control over that agency. I think when we talk about multinational organizations, one does not become more powerful by withdrawing. But that's what the United States has done. The US has also withdrawn, as you know, from the Paris Accords having to do with climate. We have become less engaged in a whole host of other multilateral institutions, and I think that this is a failure, will prove to be damaging longer term. So, China actually benefits from, I think, bad decision making here in the United States. Point one. Point two, I think the Chinese probably looked at the pandemic and all of the confusion and pain that that has been inflicting on people, both from a health standpoint, an economic standpoint, and now a political standpoint, as an opportunity to crack down on Hong Kong. And the response thus far from many nations has really been quite tepid. The one exception has been just a few hours ago, with the British indicating that they would happily accept a large number of immigrants from Hong Kong. But that does not really resolve the issue for the people who remain in Hong Kong and so on. The other thing I would say with regard to trade is that the United States likely blundered with regard to withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Let's keep in mind that the TPP was designed as a way for nations that have borders on or coasts on the Pacific, including the United States, including several nations in South America, and then, of course, the nations in East Asia. It gave those nations an opportunity to have a trade alliance which excluded China. When the United States withdrew from the TPP, the Chinese quickly started to build their own regional alliances that excluded the United States. And so what we have been seeing has been that pre-pandemic, the Chinese were actually increasing their trade among any number of these nations. Now, post-pandemic, the numbers are quite curious, of course. Number one, there's been a decline in commodity trading as a consequence of economic issues. So trade has gone down in terms of energy and so on. We have also seen this big question about supply chains. And here, I think time will tell what happens, and there will be variation by industry. A lot of the supply chains that are somehow linked to China are also linked to other parts of Asia, and therefore become very difficult to shut down. The idea that the United States, as an example, can onshore or reshore is a new expression. Many of these things back to the United States may not be the case because some of these things that we were doing with China also we were doing in relationship to other nations, including Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. So the question with regard to China is still open-ended. I don't think we have an answer to it, but it is very disturbing that most recently in the United States, we are seeing now the sort of civil unrest that makes it very difficult for the United States to hold its head up high and say, we like to believe ourselves to be an exemplar of good behavior in these regards. Not so much the last week or two.
We have two additional questions from our crowd here. For Rafaela, this one is from Daniel. What indicators of economic recovery would you look for in feeling like the economy has turned a corner? It seems that we look to certain, certain markets maybe and ignore, or mistaken markers rather, and ignore others that show the true state of the average U.S. worker. So what indicators will you be looking for in
So
identifying economic recovery.
Absolutely. So, luckily there is a lot of data that can be used. It's not, I would not necessarily look at the stock market because, as Abby was saying before and others, it's a mixture of signals that reflects also what's happening on the federal side. I would look at job creation. I would look at small businesses activity and the churn. So whether there is a net of the businesses and the jobs that we're losing, there is also tremendous growth. So personally, I would look at these markers of reallocation. To me, reallocation is the key word looking forward.
Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, I don't think we have much time for the other question. But at this point, I would like to thank all of you because this panel has been a pleasure. And I would love to continue the discussion at some other opportunity. So Abby Joseph Cohen, Advisory Director and Senior Investment Strategist at Goldman Sachs, Simon Paris, Chief Executive Officer at Finastra, Ashok Chandrasekhar, Head of the International Corporate and Securities Department at Goldfarb Seligman, and Rafaela Sodon, Professor of Business Administration in the Strategy Unit at Harvard Business School. Thank you so much for our audience, and you can for sure learn more about our panelists in the IAC on the IAC's website of the summit, and I guess they can continue to send you questions, maybe in private on social media platforms. So thank you so much. I'm Tal Heinrich in New York. It's been a real pleasure to host this panel. Many questions are still open. We don't want to make too many predictions, but hopefully we did provide some answers to all of you. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.